And welcome to this presentation on what if the process is your problem. What we're going to be doing is going over ways of mapping processes and resolving the problems that result from them. We're really happy to be part of this inaugural session of DynamicsCon, and we hope you enjoy this. So a little bit about me. My name is Bob Baird. I work in customer engagement and business analyst and customer engagement with Innovia Consulting. That picture is me in the happy days when I could be outside. That was in New Braunfels, Texas. But a little bit about me and my background. I have done a lot of process work in my life. I ran a consulting firm for mid-sized, typically privately held companies, typically manufacturers and distributors. And the group I ran did a lot of process analysis. And I've done it being a VP of supply chain and CIO, et cetera. So I've done it on kind of both sides of the wall between consulting and being in industry, and been doing this for over 20 years now, probably coming on 30 years. So what are we doing today? We're going to explore some mapping techniques, ways to map processes, how they could be used in your business. We're going to get an overview of the process for running value stream mapping sessions. And then hopefully you're going to leave with an understanding of value stream mapping and some thoughts about how and where to apply the tools. I've given this presentation, by the way. It's a webinar we do. It's actually on the Innovia website, stored there. But for other conferences, a number of other conferences. And I'm happy to report, actually, I've had one or two people come back and say, as a result of this session, they went and applied these techniques in their company and had some good results. So it surprised me a little bit that out of a webinar like this, people could do that, but hopefully you'll have takeaways that you can use. So the agenda follows what the objectives are. We're going to talk about a few mapping styles. We're going to talk about how you inspect a process, ask questions about how that process is running right now, what's broken, what's not. And then we're going to talk about what I call the process for the process. So it's the process of running value stream mapping sessions. And then at the end, we'll have a little time for some questions. So let's talk about some mapping styles. The first style I'm going to talk about is your basic flowchart map. When I ask people in-person conferences, almost everybody raises their hand and they know this. This is where you got a starting point, an ending point, you have some task activity boxes, decision diamonds, alternative branches. It's something that's great for mapping out logic flow, maybe within a program or just decision-making logic, but it's not great for defining a cross-functional business process. And here's this, for those of you who aren't sure what I was talking about, here's an example. And I'm not going to go into the example, but you can see the decisions diamonds, the start and end thing. One of the two methods we use uses flowcharting, basically flowcharting system. The other method doesn't. So let's talk about the two methods that we use. One is what we'll call swim lane map number one. What that does is talk about an activity, what happens in the step, who the activity does, what departments or personnel are involved, the tasks, right? What's being completed, the task that's completed, what happens when an activity is completed, systems, whether those are computer systems or manual systems that are used, and the time. So how long does it take on average to complete an activity? This method, we think of the two styles, is better for detailing the logic behind activities. It gets closer to kind of the programmatic flow behind activities. So it's a little more granular than the second method. And I'll share an example. This is hard to see probably depending on how big your screen is, but this first thing, the swim lanes go down this way, as you can see, they're vertically oriented. The top is an activity, and you can see the level of detail here. It's create an order, create a sales order header, create line items. We've got an EDI creation. Who does it? There's multiple people that would create an order, a sales rep in this particular company. These, by the way, are all from companies that companies whose identity is disguised, but where we've actually done these workshops. You can see sales rep, customer, etc., multiple people. The tasks, so what happens when you create an order? You upload external orders to nav, you create a sales order header, EDI, etc. This says what happens when the task is complete. In the create header, task is complete when the header is validated. When you create line items, it's when the EDI is processed. And then what are the systems? In this case, the systems for this particular company were both Microsoft Nav, Navision, now Business Central, and iPad. This company had developed a tablet-based order entry system for salespeople out in the field. And then time. There's no time noted here, but that's, you could note the elapsed time, typical time to complete the task. The second method that we use, and the one that I in particular have used most of my life, uses flowchart systems. So it represents more the logic of the process. If you look at the previous one, you didn't see any place for decision diamonds, for example. Yes, no, we're going this path or that path. You're going to map tasks at a little higher level as actions that are completed in the process. What you get is functional bands. So it's not a box just saying all these people do it. It'll show the functional bands are the actual swim lanes. You can include external functional bands. In fact, I almost always do customer and supplier. It can include the time for each task. You can annotate as much as you want. And we use coding for the system that involves, and then also some comments on task details. This we feel is better for capturing the overall process logic flow and the functional handoffs. So it has a little different functionality. And here's an example. Again, you can see this is more flowcharty, right? There's a decision. Is this a custom item? This is for purchasing, current state. If it's a custom item, then this is what happens. If it's not a custom item, you follow this. Here's some annotation around the activities. The coding for the systems in blue, it was nav. And for this company, they had a third-party WMS. And in red, that would be the WMS. Anything that's not coded in a color is done manually. And again, you can see these things are at a higher level. So there's a note here on sales demand. From sales is going to flow into planning. Going to run the planning worksheet in nav, act on transfers, delete production orders. Again, it's not the level of granular detail, but it captures the basic logic flow. These little annotations with numbers is something we sometimes do that ties it to issues or what we refer to as disconnects. I'll explain that later. Issues that were noted as we went along and mapped out the process. And here's another example. This is a swim lane, but this actually is the future state. Very kind of abbreviated annotation. I mentioned in the previous one, I go back to the previous one, sales demand, and you see a note there. In the future state, this is current orders and forecasts. So this company did not have a forecasting system or a demand management system. So in the future state, that's envisioned. So as I said, value stream maps vary by the organization, but the real purpose is how is value delivered? What's the current state? Where does waste occur? And then identify for areas of improvement, identify issues, disconnects, so you can imagine, at least develop requirements for the future state, right? And maybe draw a future state map. So as you're mapping a process, what should you be asking? What should you be investigating? So that's the querying the process. So questions to ask. One thing we note is emphasis isn't always on just doing things more efficiently. One of the first questions to ask is, why are you doing this at all? That may seem a little odd. I'll give you a quick example, not out of manufacturing and distribution, but I actually work with a large state agency that did low-income housing loans, that approved low-income housing loans, several billion every year. And we went through the loan approval process. We were mapping that out so they could develop systems around this. As we're going along, one person, we got a point where there was an approval by a particular attorney, a particular function in the agency. And when they noted issues, they said, one problem is this attorney is on the road a lot. These things often sit on his desk for 2, 3, 4 weeks, and it slows down the whole loan approval process. So the attorney wasn't part of the team, but one of the tasks for the team was to go and say, you know, why does this happen? Is there somebody else who could do it, et cetera? Well, the team reported back and said, he doesn't understand why he has to sign off on these. There's no legal reason for him to approve this at this point in the process. And hence, it was a step that didn't need to be done. I actually said to him, well, my work is done. I just cut 2 to 3 weeks out of your process. And, you know, it's much more efficient already. So, but you will find other examples, and we have found other examples where people are doing a step. Sometimes it's like auditing orders to an extent that's not really required. So highlight non-value added activities, classify them, and start to identify and prioritize the issues and possible action items. We'll talk more about that later. Here's some other questions asked. Does this really task, what you're doing here, the way you're going about it, does it really enable a competitive advantage? Reduce the price, provide faster delivery, create fewer defects. Another way to look at this is from the customer's point of view. By the way, this could be internal or external customers, right? If you're doing, if you're mapping out how you do sales and operations planning, you know, there can be internal customers for that, or order processing. You know, some of the customers for that are production or warehouse, right? But if the customer knew what you were doing, would they tell you, stop doing that? We don't need you to do that step. We don't need you to do that audit step. You know, if you could deliver faster or lower the price, go about it another way. Can you eliminate or reduce the activity? We just talked about that. And obviously, are there ways to make the activity more efficient and accurate? One thing we actually always share with people and talk to teams when we facilitate these things is look at lean manufacturing, a lesson from lean manufacturing, and it's the 8 wastes of lean. So these are things you should be thinking about. So often people go, well, that's lean manufacturing, but really it applies to any process. So is there too much waiting time to think, sit around and wait? Are we underutilizing people's talent? If we're looking at purchasing, do we have the purchasing agents do a lot of manual labor, manual work, manual pricing, and they can't actually negotiate better deals, manage their vendors better, et cetera. Defects, transportation, again, even if it's not, we're not talking about literally something getting on a truck. I had one client, in fact, one of the examples I showed you, they actually, there was a lot of transportation of paperwork from one place to another, right? There was a lot of unnecessary motion and extra processing in their process. They didn't trust some aspects of the inventory system and actually went out in the warehouse to check things out, the customer service people and the purchasing people. So these things are things you should know about, 8 great categories and 8 great sources of questions. So when in doubt, always look from the end user, the internal or external customer's perspective. Then you prioritize when and where to apply the changes for and create a future state. Use the findings. So findings brings up, well, what do you mean by findings? Well, now let's talk about the process for doing value stream mapping, for doing this process. Quick overview is you're going to do an initial map and discovery. That's really, you know, the core of the initial work. I'm going to draw a current state map in one of the 2 styles I showed you. You're going to identify issues and identify metrics. So one of the things you want to do is, how are you currently measuring this process? You know, if it's order fulfillment, how are you measuring that? What are your results right now? What's the baseline? And then you're going to create a findings document. You're not only going to have the maps, but you're going to have all of the issues, but you're going to include what we call do-its, events, and projects. Do-its, events, and projects, those are three categories of action items. And I'll go over that in a little more detail shortly. And then you're going to create a future state map as appropriate. It's not always necessary to actually create a process map of the future state, because the action items are going to really give you requirements for the future state. And one thing we find is you often can't really fully map out the future state. If I go back to that example of creating a forecasting or demand management system, a detailed map of that would be the result of actually investigating demand management systems, implementing them, understanding what they're going to look like, and then you could draw the full future state map. So you do the map as appropriate. First of all, you'll find many of the functions that you're going to map out aren't well documented, and people need to think through these things. Again, you're going to have a cross-functional team that's involved with this. A lot of functional areas support several services without clear boundaries. You're going to discover that. You want to work to identify, again, the value for the customer and the product, and look at waste even in administrative processes. Sometimes that's harder to see. It's more entrenched and hidden, but look for waste there. One thing we say is when you're mapping out the current state, any of these things is completed in a day. So scope the process you're using to a day's worth of work. And that could be breaking it up into 2 half days. I don't want to leave a lot of time between sessions. You lose the continuity. And I've actually even done this where I've done a little more than that, but we typically say, do it in a day. You want to break up the day into 2 half days, try to have them consecutive days or days close to one another. And don't take on a process that's scoped where you can't get that done. Cross-functional team, I mentioned that before. Knowledgeable doers, often middle managers, not always, but certainly people that are responsible for the process and responsible for implementing change. And what you'll have is a picture, the process map, and the team observations of what we see when you follow the product and service. So findings, I said I'd explain what a findings document is. Findings document is going to be observations that are gathered along the way and developed and reviewed by the team. It's going to include the issues, it's going to include what process, documentation about what process you're mapping, the issues that I mentioned, and then action items. Here's what I'll explain: do-its. Do-its are things that you can just walk out of the room and do. The example of the attorney who had things piling up on his desk and he didn't really even legally need to approve anything. That was something they just stopped doing, really, literally, as a result of the process. We almost always find things that are do-its. They may be, it just doesn't involve much resource at all. Events are things that take a little more analysis and some cost to implement, but it's not resource. It's mainly localized in their effect. And then projects are things where you've got to have teamwork across function, more in-depth analysis. Usually there's costs involved. You probably or maybe have to do a cost-benefit analysis to do those projects. Another thing that you do in these sessions is gather what data you can about potential ROI. That we talked about the time elapsed, the metrics that are used. You want to look at where using that data, where you can get a return on investment. Again, particularly for things that are going to be projects. Another thing that is often in a findings document is open issues. Things that aren't necessarily related even specifically to that process you're mapping, but address broader policy and cultural issues. One of the examples of one of the teams that I work with that was in the process flow I showed you earlier is an example came up with, the company had a policy basically of whatever the customer wants, we're going to do, which resulted in things that were being assembled in the warehouse, a customer changing their mind and them saying, that's fine, we'll adjust on the fly. And that was creating all kinds of issues in terms of, obviously, order fulfillment and scheduling. That's not something that's specifically wrong with the process. but it's a policy issue that needed to be raised to management. Sometimes you can affect those kind of policies, sometimes you can't, but that's an example of what I'm talking about. So I mentioned findings. We often call, I call those issues that come along where there's no value add, where you've violated one of the 8 wastes of lean. I call them disconnects. It's the method, the terminology I use. Feel free to use some more familiar term like issues list. But disconnects become part of the process going from a present to a future state. And they're a starting point for defining do-its, events, and projects. They're really, when you turn around a problem, a disconnect, an issue, they become the requirements for the future state. So I'll give you 2 examples that hopefully will illuminate that. One disconnect from one of the flows I showed you is the receipt in the warehouse management system did not consistently flow into a receipt in NAV. So the event we defined was have warehouse planning and purchasing and IT investigate why this is happening and create a plan to fix. This isn't something that I would call a project. It was really something in the interface between the 2 systems, but it critically needed to be fixed because what it meant was purchasing couldn't trust when they're creating a purchase order the inventory that was in NAV. So they actually go out in the warehouse in some cases and count the inventory, as crazy as that sounds. So that's where an issue turns into a requirement. Another one, again from the same map, is there was no visibility in future demand, particularly for stock products. This was for purchasing, but also new product launches, marketing campaigns, etc. Really created difficulty, as you might guess, for purchasing and planning. So that's an issue. This became a project and part of the future state map. Scope and implement a demand management forecasting system. I don't think this company has actually done this. They did an upgrade to NAV. It's something on their list to do. They have fixed, by the way, the inventory receipt issue. But you can kind of see where an issue that people talk about, a disconnect, turns into a requirement and an action item. So as I said, how do you do this? Completing the day with the same team, create a flexible and more reactive, frankly, proactive system that quickly adapts to change, eliminate waste, minimize the handoffs and silos. One thing when you do, by the way, that value stream map number 2, the one that does the functional bands, you can see things bouncing between the functional bands. And that's kind of noise and too much travel between things. So you can realign where things are done as a result of that. And as I said, the future state will really evolve as you work through events and projects. Another part of the whole process of doing this is what I call chartering. You know, it's create a project charter, have clear executive sponsorship. You know, some of these things are fundamental to doing any project, right? Team composition. Make sure you include all functions and your internal and external suppliers and customers. So the people that are supplying a process with data and the people who are going to be the recipient of the results of the process. People, as I mentioned, people with knowledge of the process, respected voices, change leaders. I will say, I always say this, you want people that change. Sometimes the people who really, there's somebody who really understands the process bits you want on the team, even though they're going to resist change. It's always surprising how people's attitudes change once they get in a room with all the other functions and talk through things. I've seen people who you think would be change resistant turn into change leaders, and frankly, the other way around. So, you know, don't get too hung up on that. And consider sprinkling in, as I mentioned, resistors, new voices as well. It's sometimes very useful to have somebody newer to the job who comes from another company who's going to ask, you know, get rid of the question of, well, we do it this way because we've always done it this way. They're going to challenge the always done it this way attitude. Team size, my rule is roughly 8 plus or minus 2. If it's Less than 6, you probably don't have all the functions represented. If it's more than 10, it really gets hard to manage. And again, as I said, the process, make sure the process is well defined and scoped, something you can do in a day. Another element of this whole process, I'm going to give you some meeting rules. And again, these are things I trained in facilitation many years ago that I've added to over the years. One meeting rule is everyone is equal when you're doing this. So the people that are in these sessions are there, whether they're a high-level manager or somebody from the shop floor, doesn't matter. They're there because of the value of their knowledge and the value of their input. You really need to enforce the rule that higher-level people don't talk, don't overrule other people. By the way, this also means the executive sponsor is not in these meetings. I have had some cases where the sponsor wanted to do that, but the rule that I enforced was, that's fine, you can sit there as an observer, but you can't say anything, right? But the preference is not to have the executive sponsor in the meetings. Focus on the process, not the person. Sometimes teams start talking about, well, you know, Bob doesn't always fill out his paperwork right or whatever. That's not the issue. The issue is there's a problem with the paperwork. Let's talk about that. An old rule from Deming's time was that 85% of the issues in any business are process issues, not people issues. When people are talking, make sure they be specific, not give examples. Also be specific about how often something happens. When people say, oh, we have trouble with this. Well, we have trouble all the time. Well, what's all the time mean? It's not unusual. You find out all the time is maybe once every 3 months something happens. So really be specific. Make sure that happens. Limit war stories. That's probably more true when you're dealing with consultants. But again, some people will go on and talk about, you know, oh, we used to do it this way, or this is the way this came about, etc. Try to limit that. Keep the meetings efficient. Basic conversational rules, one conversation at a time. Really, frankly, one of the very important rules to enforce. One thing I mentioned to people, which really kind of reinforces the one conversation at a time in some ways, but it's a listening rule. It's a 2-second rule. Listen to what somebody says, count 1001, 1002 kind of mentally before you respond. So just make sure somebody's completed their thought and their statement. This, if you haven't heard of it, is probably the most adopted rule. It's a 5-minute rule. You'll find as you're mapping these things out or in any meeting, you can get talking about something, get talking about an issue, and the team can start spinning its wheels. And that's when the 5-minute rule comes into play. And anybody on the team can call this. This isn't just the person running the meeting. Anybody should call it and just say, wait a minute, we're not getting anywhere here. Let's put this up as an open issue, come back to it at the end, see if we've actually addressed it in the rest of the meeting, or if we have to assign it to somebody else. But really, or in some cases, it's just a 5-minute rule. We've talked about this enough, let's move on. That's one of the most invoked rules. And obviously, mobile devices off, laptops closed during the workshop. So how do we go about doing it? What are the tools of the trade? Well, we believe very much in low tech. You want a large room with a lot of wall space. Again, keep it low tech. Post-it or flip chart like this. A kind of posted flip chart that, you know, sticks to the wall. You want that. 3x5 post-it notes. You want the sticking ones because this surface is slick, but the particularly sticking ones that you're going to use to map things out. That way you can move things around. And markers. That's it. Keep it low tech. This method allows you to move things around easily. People can see what you're doing. And you don't get bound up in technology. I have actually, in the distant past, used some technology tools, not too distant past. And frankly, you can get too bound up in the technology. I had a customer who said, hey, can we do this on whiteboard in Microsoft Teams? And I just said, no, we're going to get too tied up in the technology and it's going to slow things down and not really add any value, right? So that wraps up the session. If you want to learn more, feel free to send me an email. There's my email down there, bobbaird@innovia.com. I'm happy to answer any questions you've got. I also have this presentation in a PDF, and I'm happy to send it along. And thanks for attending. Again, we're really happy to be part of this first session at DynamicsCon. I hope you enjoyed this and enjoy what else they have to offer. Thanks a lot.